In this module, we spent our efforts in basically creating the functionality for a user to authenticate and log in as well as log out with their Google account in our application. We initially created a Google object within our lib API folder that essentially consolidated the functionality that interacted with Google servers. We've constructed an OAuth object with the help of the Google API's NPM library. And within the object that we export within this file, we have two functions, the auth URL function and a login function. The auth URL function essentially just generates an authentication URL from Google servers, which is the URL that we want the user to navigate to sign in with their Google account. And the login function essentially uses the Google People API to get the relevant information for a user signing in with their Google account. And in our application, that was their email addresses, their names, and their photos. We created 3 root level GraphQL fields. We created a auth URL query field that returns a string and is expected to return the authentication URL to the client. And we created 2 login and logout mutation fields, where in both cases a viewer object is returned. The login mutation would be responsible in essentially logging a viewer into our application, while logout does the opposite, to log them out. We created the resolver functions for these fields within a single resolvers map called viewer resolvers. Viewer is essentially the term we use to constitute a user viewing our application. And in this context, we've specified that the auth URL query field and login as well as logout are resolver functions that pertain to the domain of a viewer. The auth URL query field essentially simply returns the auth URL field from our Google object. The login mutation does a few different things. It receives at first a code from the actual input that's fed into this mutation. It also then creates a random token, and this token would essentially be used in the next modules to actually help conduct and prevent cross-site request forgery attacks. We then conduct a login via Google function, and we pass in the necessary parameters, the code, token, and database object. And this is where we then interact with Google's People API by running the login function within our lib Google object, specify and pass in the code that was given to us, and from there attempt to retrieve the user information or the relevant user information, which at the very end is basically the username, the user avatar, and the user email. If this user that we're signing in with already exists in our database, we simply update the user document in the user's collection and update it with the new potential fields we can get from the Google API. If this viewer can't be found within our database, we simply insert a brand new document instead. And lastly, the logout mutation resolver function essentially doesn't do much at this very moment and just returns an empty viewer object to the client, with which the client can do on its own. However, we're going to need the logout mutation in the upcoming modules when we deal with cookie sessions as well. Now let's move over to the client to see the work we've done over there to facilitate the changes we've made in our server. In the root index file of our client project, we've kept a viewer object as state, which is essentially the representation of the viewer who's either signed in or signed out of our application, and we'll need this information everywhere in our application later on. We created the GraphQL document for the 3 new root level GraphQL fields, such as the auth URL GraphQL query and the login and logout GraphQL mutations. We also constructed a login component that will be shown in the login route of our application. And it's in this login component that we give the user the capability to sign in with their Google account. And the way we conduct this is we initially use the Apollo client object to actually have the capability to query the auth URL field when the user actually clicks the sign in with Google button. And when successfully authorized and the user logs in with the Google account, Google will return them back to the redirect URL we've specified in our Google Developer Console, which is the /login route of our app. So they'll get taken back to this login component, which is why we have a use effect constructed to essentially check and say, does a code exist in the actual URL parameter? And if it does, it essentially means we've been redirected back to Google, and this is where we run the login mutation and pass in the code that we've retrieved. And finally, when the login mutation is successful, we simply redirect the successfully logged in viewer to their own user page. And lastly, another large piece of work we've done is we've also constructed an app header component, which is essentially the component element that will be shown in the header of our application whenever the user is in any route within our app. And in this app header component, we give the user the capability to log out, or in other words, to run the logout mutation. And when the user simply clicks the logout submenu item, we just conduct the logout mutation. Now, once again, this logout mutation at this moment doesn't do much. However, we're going to need it later on when we deal with cookie sessions. And this is, once again, to reiterate, just a rough, larger summary of the work we've done. In all of these module conclusion videos, we're not going to dive deep into every single line of code, but instead we're going to summarize the main pieces that we've done within the module.